Good morning, good afternoon, good evening again, folks, Politics and Media 101 fans. We were going to put this into our John Fetterman episode, but we've had so much fun discussing the debate that we are wrapping this up into today's episode, which is not only the Ukraine letter from the Congressional Progressive Caucus, which I'll give a quick overview of, but really the state of discourse around Ukraine-Russia, and also if there is any type of sensible voices advocating for diplomacy and whether that would be appropriate right now. So just to give a quick overview, the Congressional Progressive Caucus earlier last week released a letter that is outlining their demands to President Biden. While supporting him, they also said that they had hoped that a dual track of diplomacy between the United States and Russia would be open. And they released that letter. The letter was dated in June, which was interesting because it just got released in late October. And as a result of releasing that letter, they received backlash from centrist Republicans, from conservative Republicans, and from basically everybody across the Democratic spectrum. The 30 members that signed this letter very quickly. You had folks like Jake Auchincloss, moderate Democrat, calling for them to retract it. You had members who signed the letter coming out saying that they didn't support it now. They supported it back when they originally signed it. And ultimately, the Congressional Progressive Caucus, Pramila Jayapal, came out and rescinded the letter. It took her a day, but she rescinded the letter and says, no, we're very sorry. This was a staffer who messed this up, but ultimately, we do not stand by what we said. We want to take this letter back. So, John, I was hoping from your perspective, we could get into maybe what the substance of the letter was, in fact, first, and then we can get into the backlash and whether it was legitimate backlash or other reasons were for it.
Well, I think to understand the substance of the letter, we do have to evaluate this claim that the letter was originally written in June and was not meant to be published in the context of October 2022, right? Because the substance is the context. I mean, the calls for diplomacy and so on are pinned to the moment in time in which those calls are coming, right? And the substance, the members who signed it believe that it was misinterpreted, misunderstood, because the substance was intended at a time when it made more sense in context. The reason we're evaluating whether this claim is true is because it seemed dubious on its face. The idea that these members were blaming staff and saying that the letter was intended for a different context, something that needs to be validated, because it does smell a bit of, cover my ass, so to speak, CYA.
Oh, you used a naughty word, John. Look at you.
Yeah, well, we're recording right now, so I'm not going full blue. But it does sound a bit like cover my ass. So we took a look through, and I noticed that there are 9 hyperlinks in this letter. There's 9 hyperlinks. Every single hyperlink is linked to an article that was published in May or June. So this strongly suggests that the letter was indeed written earlier this summer. And that's relevant for the reasons I mentioned.
And real quick, just to highlight that, back in May or June, there appeared to be a stalemate. Just to give the timeline, a stalemate of the war and the conditions on the ground. And today there's a massive offensive going on in Ukraine's favor.
Yeah, I'll get into some of the reasons why the context matters and what's happened since then.
Cool.
But first I want to say that there is one detail in here that we could find that suggests that the letter might have been updated or edited since it was originally written and circulated for signature from members of Congress. And that is a reference to annexations. So it says, we are under no illusions regarding the difficulties involved in engaging Russia, given its outrageous and illegal invasion of Ukraine, and its decision to make additional illegal annexations of Ukrainian territory. So this, at first glance, looks like it's a reference to current events, because very recently, Russia had these illegitimate referenda conducted in the 4 oblasts of Ukraine that they're occupying, in addition to Crimea, the other 4. And these were condemned and characterized as illegal annexations by much of the global community, for lack of a better word.
Especially legal scholars and such.
Yeah, really everyone. Everyone was using the word annex. I shouldn't say everyone, but many, many people across fields, disciplines, national allegiances were condemning this.
Careful with your hyperbole, Mr. Gunnison.
And using the phrase annexation. So this does seem like maybe it's a reference to more recent events. And the question is, was the letter edited after it was originally written and circulated for signature? That would explain why there was such harsh backlash from members who had signed it and were not expecting it to be released. If the letter was modified after they had signed off on it, that would be a big scandal in its own right, right? However, I'm not sure that we can really conclude that, because annexations sounds like it's referring to this current event, but it could feasibly, plausibly refer to earlier events. Russia invaded Ukraine much more thoroughly than they had previously in February. In February, they started this full invasion, full-scale offensive against Ukraine, and were capturing lots of territory. It could be that annexations just refers to that. It's possible. So I don't think that that's enough where we can really conclude that the letter was edited and modified afterwards, but it is possible. So now I want to talk about what's happened since May and June that make the letter more controversial or less appropriate. So there's three things that I'm looking at here. So the first one is the counteroffensive. And Justin, you already mentioned this, but since the summer, Ukraine had been going on large counteroffensive and have been recapturing territory in some of the regions that the Russian military were occupying. We had a whole program talking about this with Mark Kansian. It's been a big development. It's changed the tide of the war. So at this point, it would be thus less appropriate to say, we got to freeze the conflict in its place and try to reach a settlement based on the status quo, because Ukraine are on the front foot. They have momentum. The tide is changing. It's less necessary for us to make this call. And it reads very differently to make the call under these circumstances. The second thing is that there actually have been some successful negotiations since the letter was written, including on an issue that the letter references specifically. So the letter makes a reference to food supplies. They are talking about how Ukraine and Russia are such large producers and exporters of food, and how the world is being impacted by the inability of food. I want to find the exact quote. It does reference food. Yeah, it says, the conflict threatens an additional tens of millions of people worldwide because skyrocketing prices of wheat, fertilizer, and fuel spark acute crises in global hunger and poverty, right? So the skyrocketing prices of wheat are impacted by the war. So since this letter was originally written in June, there has been a successful negotiation on this specific issue, and this is the Black Sea Grain Initiative. So this was originally unveiled in July. So a month after the letter was originally written, a deal was reached to allow for the export of wheat from Russia and Ukraine. Big development. And it was negotiated partially, largely, I think we can even say from what we know, by Turkey, a NATO ally who Ukraine have a lot of trust in, but who also have an ear in Russia. So the call for negotiations on this issue are much less relevant since it's happening. There's less need to call for a negotiation on that kind of point when we're actually seeing that, and the United States isn't necessarily playing this active role on that topic. So that's the second reason why I think the context is really different. The third reason is U.S. elections. The election is only 1 month away in the United States, national election. And the Democratic campaigns are emphasizing the wishy-washy position that many Republicans are taking on U.S. support for Ukraine, including Leader McCarthy, who could become the Speaker of the House if Republicans win a majority in the U.S. House. So with that in mind, Democrats who signed this letter, because it's all Democrats who signed the letter, would certainly be less likely to see this letter published when their campaign are pointing to the wishy-washy Republican support on Ukraine as a reason why voters should go and vote for Democrats. So that's the third reason why I think the context is really different. and why the letter that was intended to be released in June, from what we can tell, has gotten so many people upset that it was instead released in October.
And just to quickly add, so thank you, John. That was very helpful. To add some context about what could be going on, the current narrative around negotiation, there seems to be somewhat of a vacuum, and I use that term liberally. I'm not saying negotiations aren't happening. John just explained how negotiations are happening. But from a public discourse perspective, Elon Musk and this Twitter tech jackass David Sachs is the only way I can describe him. Those two have been filling the void. And there are seriously concerning reports about Musk liaising with Putin and using talking points. But David Sachs has also been filling the void. And these folks have massive. Elon Musk has 109 million Twitter followers, and David Sachs has a lot. And while there aren't many Americans on Twitter, the policy world is on Twitter addictedly. Same with the media world. So these folks have been getting in spats with true foreign policy experts and Russia experts like Tom Nichols, and there's a bunch of other folks. And they've been promoting the idea that the United States not only needs to seek diplomacy, but basically push Ukraine to make concessions to surrender so that on Russia's terms. So that's an important context. But also, per a Politico article that was written, and this is a direct quote, a source familiar with the situation told Politico that Jayapal personally approved the release of the letter on Monday. Spokespeople for the Congressional Progressive Caucus referred us back to their statement. So that is very important because it would appear to this humble outsider that she was releasing the letter because the demand for negotiations had peaked, so to speak, due to Elon Musk and David Sachs making requests for negotiations, and then they're starting an argument over Twitter, and then it becoming more mainstream. And she was just trying to capitalize on this to show her progressive bona fides. Additionally, members of the squad like AOC and others have been getting harangued at town halls by tankies, criticizing them for voting to support Ukraine with military and economic aid. So this could also be seen as, heading into the election season, a way of shielding her more progressive members from those town halls that they have been getting harangued at from the far, the communists, these tankies. I won't even say they're left. So that's some additional context, John. And I think that based in that context and understanding that Jayapal allegedly approved the release of this letter and could have even potentially edited it, maybe not, I think that there does deserve to be some blame leveled, because even if the substance wasn't too bad, which I would like you to get into, it does potentially show that she was trying to play off of the current context and imply that these folks wanted negotiations like Elon Musk and David Sachs were making more notorious.
Yeah, so there's a few things I want to say. I was trying to find some quotes from Jayapal that came from earlier this year that I kind of wanted to address, because I think that there's a real misunderstanding, including among some members of Congress, about what diplomacy actually is. And the thing that frustrates me a lot is when I see diplomacy used as this kind of hand-waving magic word. And I've noticed this happens so often. It's a very common pattern.
It felt like they were using diplomacy to virtue signal, John, and virtue signal that they're with the Musks and Sachs of the world.
I think that some people use the word diplomacy as if it's some kind of silver bullet, like it's an independent tool that can just be applied and fix problems. And that's not really what diplomacy is. Diplomacy is a process that is backed up by lots of other factors. It's backed up by the power that your country projects. In order to do a successful negotiation on the international stage, you have to do it from the position of credibility. And that's usually backed up by some kind of threat, especially, an implicit threat. So I remember this. Yeah, this is what I thought was funny. I found this quote from Jayapal. This is from January of this year. So I want to be very clear that this was before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, which happened at the end of February. This is not before the invasion of Ukraine. by Russia, because that happened in 2014 and it has been ongoing since then. But it was before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, this much more dangerous and expansive stage of the war that started earlier this year. So this is the quote from her. She says, no, sorry, pardon me. This is not from Jayapal. This is from Rashida Tlaib. So Rashida Tlaib says, I agree with Jayapal and Barbara Lee. Diplomacy and de-escalation must be the focus, not lethal aid. My constituents are tired of war and demanding we use everything in our toolbox to prevent conflict. So it's in these two sentences, there's such a clear contradiction. And I think that it exposes a total misunderstanding of what diplomacy is. So she says we should not provide lethal aid to Ukraine. We should not arm Ukraine. We must use everything in our toolbox to prevent conflict. So this seems like a pretty obvious contradiction, just one sentence after the other. If we're not going to use lethal aid to Ukraine, the arming of Ukraine with defensive weapons, we are surrendering tools in our toolbox that are going to create a safer situation, aren't we? I mean, it's saying we must take this tool out of our toolbox, and then immediately afterwards saying we must use everything in our toolbox.
Just to go in with you, this is the quote from this Congressional Progressive Caucus letter in January, saying that they basically were concerned about weapons going. We have significant concerns that new troop deployments, sweeping indiscriminate sanctions, and a flood of hundreds of millions of dollars in lethal weapons will only rise tensions and increase the chance of miscalculation. Russia's strategy is to inflame tensions. The United States and NATO must not play into the strategy. This is the end of the quote. In past crises, where events are moving quickly and intelligence is unclear, vigorous, delicate diplomacy is essential to de-escalation. We call upon our colleagues to allow the administration to find a diplomatic way out of this crisis. And end quote. To your point, it's juxtaposing sanctions and arming the Ukrainians with diplomacy as if it's some zero sum.
Yeah, I'm looking at this too. I was actually going to go into the same quotes next, so we're thinking along the same lines here. But again, this is similar to the point I was making about the shorter Tlaib quote. But this is treating diplomacy as if it's this independent tool that's mutually exclusive with the things that are actually components of diplomacy and how diplomacy happens, right? So instead of arming Ukraine, instead of sanctions, instead of troop deployments, we should do diplomacy. But what is diplomacy? Diplomacy is the whole process involving all of those threats and tools and means. You put the stuff on the table, you deploy it in a lot of cases, like the sanctions, and that gives you a stronger, more credible position as you approach a negotiation. You have things that you can offer to the other side because you've got sanctions on the table that have been deployed. You can say, we will remove these sanctions in exchange for some behavior activity on your side. You don't disregard, abandon, and eliminate the possibility of any of your tools, and then diplomacy becomes some independent activity that's disconnected from all of those other things. That's not what diplomacy is at all. And so these figures who are intending to be thought leaders on issues of foreign policy and global affairs seem to just fundamentally misunderstand the entire concept of what diplomacy is. And they treat it as if it's this independent floating thing that's not connected to any of the other tools that we have to use in order to do that process.
Jayapal is the leader of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, which is one of the largest caucuses, and she has a desire to be in House leadership, which is important, right? You get into House leadership, and then there's a real chance that you could be a speaker someday. John, is this just these members playing politics and virtue signaling to the left of the party to stake out them being different than, the more establishment mainstream members and maybe get some support from their grassroots groups and think tanks like the Quincy Institute? Or do we think that this is a legitimate misunderstanding of how foreign policy works? And could they have accomplished the former, which I just described, without sounding so tone deaf and maybe ignorant?
No, I think it's a sincere misunderstanding. And I don't think that the motives of these members are misplaced. I think that it's based a lot on reaction to the Iraq war, to a large extent also the Afghanistan war, but especially the Iraq war. which was more controversial and got so much more coverage and was really politically salient in the United States in the way that, unfortunately, the Afghanistan war wasn't. But they've seen U.S. military overreach, and they want to aggressively advocate for us to take military tools out of the equation, right? And I think that maybe there's a little bit of misunderstanding that even when we pursue these successful negotiations without deploying military tools in a hot war context, those negotiations are still backed up by the military tools that we have because they enhance our credibility in these circumstances. And that's kind of what I've been trying to emphasize. Also, I think that it's a really kind of convenient aspiration. It's wishful thinking to think that, well, why don't we just do this? Because that would solve the problem. Why don't we do this? And the idea that we can solve a conflict without thinking about the military component or just kind of wishing it away, pretending that it's not a factor. It's really appealing, right? It's really appealing to say diplomacy, that will solve the problem and treat it like a silver bullet, but it's just not pragmatic or practical. And what frustrates me is when people use diplomacy as just this silver bullet, like I said, a cure-all word, and don't give any elaboration, because that's just not enough. Like, you can't just say, do diplomacy, that'll fix it. You have to explain a little bit more about what you're proposing that we offer. And that's what we're often missing here. We don't, and in this letter, we say, let's try diplomacy. That's pretty anodyne. I don't think a lot of people really disagree with that on its face. And that's why I don't think the letter in its full substance and content is that big a deal. Propose the diplomatic shape, propose the negotiation.
I think in the letter somewhere, it basically says the U.S. and Russia should have diplomatic talks, and it outlines that those two countries, is that accurate?
Direct engagement with Russia. So while we're criticizing this, I don't want us to misquote it. So they are saying direct engagement with Russia.
So for me, John, it's very ironic. And I am not saying that this criticism is wrong, but from the left, a lot of the time, especially the progressive left, especially members that signed this letter, there is a criticism of the United States overstepping our bounds in international conflicts and on the international stage, thinking that we can be the policemen and women and solve the world's problems. In this instance, they are talking about a direct conflict that the United States directly, we're not fighting, our troops are not on the ground. It is between Russia and Ukraine. And to solve a conflict between two countries that the United States is not directly involved in, they think that the United States can be the world's policemen and women, step in, use the magic silver bullet of diplomacy, talk with Russia, maybe even not involve Ukraine in these talks and solve these problems. So for me, it's very ironic. And no matter when the letter is written, it would seem to go against a core criticism from the left of the United States and the quote unquote, the blob. So I was wondering what you were thinking there, because it seemed a little bit out of character and quite frankly, offensive to Ukraine.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, that if the United States were to be the lead negotiator on Ukrainian peace, that we would be acting like the world's policeman. I think that's an interesting point. Yeah, it is a kind of American exceptionalism to say that the United States has to be the protagonist. But, I understand from a certain point of view, if you're an American policymaker, to say, look, we're only responsible in some sense for America's actions. So can we go and solve the problem? And I think that it reflects maybe a little bit of impatience, because the reality is Russia are the protagonists of this war, right? They're the ones that have pursued the aggressive activity that have led to so much suffering. And they're the ones that are going to have to take the most significant steps to end the conflict. I mean, Ukraine's territory will not be secure as long as Russia are doing what they're doing. And they're the ones that need to show a bit of initiative if we want the conflict to end. And it's frustrating for Americans because we wish that we could do something about it in that sense. We wish that we could take diplomatic steps to end the war, and we really can't. It's Russia that need to do that. And I think a lot of these American policymakers, we put out a letter saying Russia should negotiate an end to the war. I mean, what's the use in that?
So I think there might be some use, and please help me understand this. to play devil's advocate here, the letter seems to be supporting President Biden arming Ukraine and also advocating for more robust diplomacy. It feels like you have Ukraine stands and people that are fully supporting Ukraine, and I fully support Ukraine. And then on the other side, you have the Tucker Carlsons and Marjorie Taylor Greens who want to stop arming Ukraine and want to give everything to Russia. So isn't there some value then in what these policymakers from the Congressional Progressive Caucus are advocating for, even if the timing is a little bit off? Or has the timing being off just completely undermined what they were trying to accomplish, which is to say there needs to be legislators advocating for more robust diplomacy?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's perfectly appropriate in general for members of Congress, other Americans, to say that the United States should be open to diplomatic solutions to the war. I mean, there's nothing that's really that controversial about that comment in and of itself. You know, we talked about why this letter is controversial for other reasons that have to do with subtext, that have to do with the timing of the circulation of the letter and how vague it is about the solutions it's offering. But I think that it's a quite anodyne sentiment to say the United States should be open to diplomatic solutions. Fine. I don't think anyone really disagrees with that. But as I was saying a minute ago, the onus is really on Russia to show willingness and credibility and initiative in that regard. So we can all agree that diplomatic solutions would be wonderful, but we're kind of sitting here and hoping that the other party has the capacity to play its role in that process. Another thing here, this is, I think, kind of connected to your point about the reason why Americans want to have a bit of ownership over the outcome, is that we have invested a lot of U.S. public money in this effort. And
I think it's over $66 billion.
Yeah, so this is referenced here in the letter. They say, as legislators responsible for the expenditure of tens of billions of U.S. taxpayer dollars in military assistance, we believe such involvement in the war creates a responsibility for the United States to explore all possible avenues, including direct engagement with Russia. So, you know, we talked a little bit about this direct engagement thing. Let's just talk instead now about the idea that we're stakeholders because of all that we've invested, and that gives the United States reason to kind of ask for something in return. And I think that that's not an unfair comment either. You know, we can look at the amount of money that we've spent in comparison to our overall defense budget and overall foreign aid budget and look at the results and say, you know, this has yielded quite an outcome for our interest. You know, we've been very effective at supporting Ukraine and be generally pleased with that. But you know, that's not quite enough. Like, we want to investigate exactly how all the money is being used. We were talking about this with Mark Hansen when he came in our program. We're comparing all of this money that's being spent on this conflict to Afghanistan. And we're talking about how there was quite a bit of corruption in the way that U.S. public resources were used in Afghanistan. And the United States had an investigatory body that looked into all of that and did very damning and often quite comprehensive reports. And this is Sagar, the Special Investigator General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. Should there be a Sagar for all of the money that's being spent in Ukraine? We talked about that with Mark Hansen, and you know, he said that he'd love to see an effort like that. And I don't think any of us, you know, are going to probably disagree with that. I think it's fair to say that the money we're spending gives us, you know, a stake in the outcome and a reason to ask for certain things, for efficiency, for ethical use of resources, and also specific outcomes in the conflict, right? So I think that that's also fair. But the problem is just that if we're talking about the overall outcome of the war, it's so hard to put too much of the responsibility on the U.S. side because of the essential and overriding role of Russia.
So then, to be blunt, if we're going to advocate, if lawmakers are going to advocate for diplomacy, they should be saying Russia should be seeking diplomacy with Ukraine as opposed to centering this on the United States. Or am I misunderstanding?
Well, here's what I would say to that. I already talked about how saying Russia should come to the table members of the U.S. Congress writing a letter that says that is going to have no impact. It's like throwing it off into a gust of wind. It's meaningless. That Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin aren't going to see a letter from Jayapal and say, "Oh my God, we need to act on this. This is such an excellent idea that we never considered before."
But the Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, may see that letter, and it may be enough virtue signaling from Jayapal and the Congressional Progressive Caucus, who don't understand foreign policy, to accomplish their domestic political goals, and in a way that's not, harmful.
Yeah, I mean, we're getting a little bit further away from focus here. So, with that in mind, they are somewhat appropriately saying, United States, do this, because the United States is them and we'll listen to them. They're members of the United States government, the legislative branch. So, fine, right? So, is it wrong for them to say this? Not really, but it doesn't make a huge amount of difference. Putting out a letter that just says diplomacy, we say, okay, diplomacy. In order for this to be really substantive, they should outline the shape of a negotiation that they're proposing. Because that's, again, the other really missing piece here. The missing piece is the initiative from Russia. That's the biggest missing piece, right? We talked about that. The other missing piece is if you're asking the United States to make a deal, tell us what the deal is. Because otherwise, we're promoting an idea, which some have promoted, that the United States has the power to end the conflict if it would only make a deal.
Take Russia's side and make a deal.
Make a deal. But, what is the deal that we should make? Tell us that, and then we can evaluate whether it's a worthwhile proposal, feasible. And that's what I'm often not seeing in these calls for diplomacy, and that's why they can be quite frustrating.
To play on that, John, and I agree with everything you're saying, and I think it's great analysis. I think that largely the tech bros, Elon Musk, David Sachs, people that are just contrarians, I don't know that, the Twitter folks, and I'm sure you could name some with the Substacks that just say stuff that is quote unquote heterodox. Those folks, to me, are ignorant of the foreign policy issues, and I think to foreign policy experts, but they're talking about foreign policy to virtue signal to a domestic audience and get support to a domestic audience. And that's how I largely see these folks, in addition to having large egos where they're saying, I'm the smartest brain and I'm going to bring the solution and I'm the only one with the solution. I don't see the egotistical narcissism from the CPC in that regard, but I do see specifically with the timing of this letter coming 2 weeks before an election, with it allegedly being approved by the head of the CPC, and with it being just void of any expertise and also outside of the context that it was originally written with. I see this as an opportunity by the Congressional Progressive Caucus to leverage a foreign tragedy for domestic gain in an election cycle. And that's where I get a little concerned, John, because these folks are always on the sanctimonious moral soapbox about foreign affairs and about conflict and about ending these conflicts and about their care for, human welfare. And in this instance, to me, this feels like a naked political play. So it's very confusing. I don't know how to understand how much outrage should be directed to them, what type of consequences. Should we trust progressives when it comes to foreign policy if they're willing to release a letter like this at this time, so misguided and outside of the context of the current scope of the war? So what are the larger ramifications from this letter, or should there be none?
Well, what I'm expressing is less outrage and more frustration. And I think that your comment that it plays to a domestic audience makes sense for some of the reasons we're talking about. It's a very appealing message because it's so convenient. The idea that the United States has it in its power to end this war by doing certain things, by pursuing certain things, by making a deal, we can end the war. I mean, that's such an appealing message. It would be wonderful if that were the case, because then we can go ahead and end the war, right? But the practical reality is that the United States are not responsible for this war, and we don't have the ability through independent initiative to end it, right? It's a misunderstanding of the causes of the war in some case that I think are driving this. There's been a lot of discussion about NATO and the role that NATO played in this war starting. And In some of our conversations, we've tried our best to kind of debunk that. And we can get into all of that again. I'm happy to. But the fact of the matter is that NATO is not responsible for this conflict. And many of the arguments that are put forward as to how that might be fail some pretty basic logical tests. Russia are responsible for this war. The war really escalated and was instigated because Russia denied Ukraine self-determination, not on security matters as much as you might think, especially on economic matters. Russia do not believe that Ukraine should be permitted politically to integrate themselves into the European single market and pursue EU membership. This was the real spark that instigated this entire conflict. Russia wished to turn Ukraine into a vassal state and deny them the ability to determine their own basic economic and trade policy. At the time that the conflict started, NATO membership was not a particularly popular option inside of Ukrainian domestic politics. And it also wasn't a very salient one. It wasn't something that Ukrainians talked about or thought about very much, including the government.
It wasn't realistic.
The big issue was over Ukraine's trade and economic policy. Ukraine wanted to integrate into the European single market, pursue EU membership. And so they had signed an EU association agreement to push them in this direction. They had witnessed the trajectory of former Eastern Bloc countries like Poland, like Romania, like Hungary, the Czech Republic, East Germany. And they had seen how these countries went from destitution, economic destitution in the Cold War era, to quite advanced, integrated, flourishing economies. And this is the future that Ukrainians really want. The Ukrainians aren't looking at Western countries and their military alliances as the aspiration. And they're looking at Eastern Europe and Central Europe. That's the Europe that they want to be part of. And you can hear Zelensky in some of his speeches, he lists the European countries and he talks about them. And he starts with those countries. And you can hear the affection in his voice when he talks about Poland and Romania and the Czech Republic. This is the Europe that he wants to join. It's not Spain and France and the United Kingdom and the Netherlands. And when you hear him talk about those countries, it's in a much more kind of distant and abstract way. What they wanted was to follow the trajectory of these other countries in their neighborhood. They saw how those countries were transformed socially and economically by integration into Europe. They were pursuing this EU association agreement. The Russian government put a lot of pressure on the leader at the time, Yanukovych, to rip it up and instead join Russia's Eurasian Economic Union. These are mutually exclusive options because you can't be part of both of these economic integration mechanisms. They're at odds with each other. It's one or the other. And after this controversy over throwing away the EU association agreement, hard fought to join the Eurasian Economic Union, the people of Ukraine rose up and protested against Yanukovych, forced him from office, and tried to put Ukraine back on the European path. This is when Russia annexed Crimea through an illegal referendum and the little green men that invaded the Crimean Peninsula. This is when Russia started the proxy war that they were fighting in the Donbass, the two oblasts in eastern Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk, which eventually they tried to declare as independent republics. This is when the conflict began. It was over these issues. It wasn't over NATO. And it wasn't really over the United States or anything much connected to the United States. The United States is not a member of the European Union. The United States is not a member of the European single market. The aspiration of the Ukrainians, the salient issues that started the conflict, were pretty apart from anything the United States are really directly involved in. And like I said, it's a very convenient wish. The idea that this was all over a military alliance that the United States has so much control and influence over, it would be wonderful if this were true, because then the United States could solve the conflict and we could all forget about it. But that's not why any of this is happening.
So let's dig into then the current foreign policy discourse and maybe the different polls. And specifically, you've outlined the start of the conflict and motivations that would be different from folks we've even had on this show, and they'd be quote unquote more restraint minded, restraintists. So on one hand, you have the folks that are advising the Congressional Progressive Caucus on foreign policy, and they tend to blame NATO for starting conflicts with Russia. Just the threat of it. They tend to blame the United States arming other countries, broadly and generally speaking. And they tend to approach this maybe from more of an isolationist perspective. And then you have the foreign policy establishment, which ranges from conservative groups like the Hudson Institute to other groups in the middle, who would say that's poppycock, and that's not actually what happened. So there has to be some type of genuine misunderstanding that leads to this looking at the same set of circumstances, the same inputs, and coming to completely radically different conclusions. And then when they're advising these members on Congress, they also, do you think, misunderstanding that diplomacy is a dual track that continues, or is something getting lost in translation? I'm confused how experts, foreign policy think tank experts, can advise these members, brief these members, and then the members come out with letters that are just unequivocally not understanding the issues at hand and at a fundamental level.
Well, look, the narrative that the United States is at the center of all of this is an appealing and convenient one. And, we keep on coming back to that. And I think that that's really the issue. It's a U.S.-centric view that puts the United States at the center of this and says the United States might have caused this. Some people say that. And then others say the United States can solve this. And neither of these are really practical, but they're very appealing. And if you're looking at everything from a U.S. perspective, I can understand why you would think of things that way. So one thing that we kept on hearing about how the United States could prevent escalation in Ukraine was the United States should make a commitment that Ukraine will not join NATO. This would solve the problem. If only we'd done that, then Russia wouldn't escalate and engage in this full-scale invasion.
And it tends to be the think tanks that usually align with more progressive-leaning members on foreign policy issues that would be proposing these views, and also the far right.
Yeah, I would say that something like the Quincy Institute, which is probably especially what you're thinking of, they're not as much Democrats, Republicans. They're kind of mixed because the restrainer camp spans both political parties. It reflects a little bit of what people think of as horseshoe theory, that the extreme ends of the left and the right are like a horseshoe. They're meeting. You're curving the political spectrum, and they're coming close to touching each other on the extreme ends, like a horseshoe. The Quincy Institute and the kind of thinking behind some of it is an example a little bit of what people are thinking when they talk about horseshoe. Also, I often think that the political spectrum is a misleading way of thinking about how politics are aligned. The thing is, it's dots of people here and there across the different areas that you would think about as the political spectrum that are fit into the restrainer camp. Like Tim Kaine I think that he's a restrainer. He's not an extreme leftist. He's not an extreme right winger. He's a credible, respected, mainstream senator who is part of that camp. I think that if you look at the personnel who are associated with something like Quincy, it does include people who are dotted across our understanding of the political spectrum, right? So going back to this idea that the United States could have prevented the conflict by saying that Ukraine would not join NATO. Again, very convenient idea, because if it were true, it'd be wonderful, because we would just do it and there would be no conflict. But it fails the most basic logical analysis. You take one look at that sentiment and it just collapses. So what is NATO? NATO is at its heart a mutual defense pact. Article 5 of NATO, right? That's where it says that if a country is attacked, that is part of the bloc, they can call the rest of the bloc and ask them to engage in mutual defense. Ukraine, since 2014, have been engaged in a hot conflict with Russia. Russia are occupying Ukrainian territory in the Crimean Peninsula. They are, through proxies and through some reports, active Russian military. They were occupying large parts of the Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast as well, and the Donbass. Ukraine are in a hot conflict with a nuclear armed power. Why would the members of NATO, more than 20 members, what is it, 20, 28 members, why would they let a country into a mutual defense pact that are in a hot conflict with a nuclear power? Why would they do that? They would not do that. There is no chance, no feasible reality in which Ukraine would be admitted to NATO under these circumstances. It would never happen. It doesn't need to be explicitly said because it is so obvious. The other aspect of this presumes that U.S. guarantees have a lot of value to Vladimir Putin, that Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin would alter their entire strategy in their key foreign policy initiative based on a U.S. guarantee. So it's funny that this comes from a lot of the same people who often criticize U.S. credibility, because you're saying that the most valuable thing in this entire conflict is some kind of U.S. promise or commitment, and that the Kremlin and Putin understand it this way as well, that they value a U.S. promise more than anything else. Just look at the recent history, and this is where I'm being quite critical of the United States. Look at the recent history of U.S. negotiations. The Paris Agreement, the JCPOA, within one presidential term, they were disposed of, disregarded. You can also look at stuff like the Rome Statute that made the ICC, International Criminal Court. The U.S. were part of that initiative and then backed out. Same thing, UN Convention on the Law on the Sea. Same thing with the League of Nations. Same thing with the International Trade Organization. It goes on and on and on. The U.S. back out of commitments that they make constantly. So
we're going back to the League of Nations now?
Sure. I mean, this narrative spans so much of U.S. history, including the time that we've been a great power. So, the idea that this U.S. promise is the key to unlocking the whole thing, Joe Biden or Tony Blinken saying Ukraine won't join NATO, that's what mattered, that if only they had said that, there would have been no conflict. It's pretty ludicrous. Why would Putin and the Kremlin put so much value in a U.S. promise given this pattern? And also, you can just look at the stuff that Putin had been saying before and during the escalation. He's not really talking that much about the things that many of these American commentators are saying are the key to everything. I mean, he's talking much more in the rhetoric of those who look most cynically at the Kremlin's motives, that it's a war of national supremacy, and that Ukraine don't deserve to have independence and really are meant to be under the Russian thumb. He's saying this stuff pretty explicitly. So those of us who are the most cynical about Putin's motives, I mean, we're backed up by the words that Putin is saying. So I really look at the idea that NATO and U.S. promises are the key to this, solving the conflict as pretty ridiculous. And if we're going to talk about U.S. initiatives solving things, I want to hear something a little bit better about what we can put on the table. It can't just be this NATO thing, because we can throw that out the window just by looking at it for all the reasons I said.
Yeah, and back to the letter. I know you got on your hobby horse there, NATO, but I think it was very valuable to walk through that and show how it wasn't the U.S.'s fault. Really, also debunk the diplomacy only track. From my perspective, John, ultimately the letter was created. It was put out there. That was, in January. Let's start with January. The Congressional Progressive Caucus basically said, "Whoa. We need to also be doing diplomacy. I don't know about arming these folks in Ukraine." And then now in October, the end of October, they put out this letter again advocating for diplomacy. And it feels like, that single track diplomacy, that silver bullet diplomacy that you just went and explained why that isn't necessarily accurate. And then they came back and recanted and retracted their letter, basically saying, no. We totally support Ukraine. We support everything that President Biden is doing. He should keep doing it. So from a foreign policy perspective, if anything, I think the consequences will be a doubling down from the Biden administration on what they're doing, with less pushback from folks in their party. I think the real ramifications of this letter, though, you have to realize these members probably signed it in June, thinking that the letter would be published in June and sent to the administration in June. And then it wasn't. It was held, and ultimately it was sent out in October. I can guarantee you that from the response that we received, these members were blindsided. They didn't. Even Rep Ilhan Omar came out and said, "We signed this in June. The context is different." Everybody said that. They were not expecting this to be published. So I think the true consequences here are Pramila Jayapal's credibility has been destroyed, not only with 30 members that signed this letter, but also the other members in her caucus. She was legitimately going to be vying for a leadership position, and she may still very well get a leadership position. But from my perspective, I think that this letter severely damages her because being a congressional leader, you need to fight for your people in your district, but also you need to be aware of issues on the foreign stage. There's a group of 8, the security folks, and then the congressional leaders, like the real leaders, like Speaker Pelosi and Schumer and McConnell, who meet on massive security, national security issues, like when there's a high level assassination or threats. So foreign policy is part of this job, and she's really damaged years and maybe even decades of progressives trying to increase their credibility in this sphere. So I think the two consequences are it probably hurts and maybe ends her leadership bid before it begins. And also, I'm concerned that it will prevent a different type of voice from being heard within the Democratic caucus moving forward, where progressives who maybe want to pump the brakes on, wars or conflicts or sanctions, maybe they aren't as eager or willing to step up in the future, even if they are wrong. Because I do think ultimately this type of dissension is good. We don't want groupthink. Even if I usually don't agree with the progressives, I think that having their voice heard is a valuable part of our system, and it really makes us what's different from one party rule that we see in so many authoritarian states. So there's the benefit where probably we won't have to worry about Jayapal and leadership, but there is the concern that this degrades our discourse moving forward.
Yeah, so I've got a few things to say about this, maybe kind of like 3 different categories of thought here. So the first one is, what's the blowback and who's it going to blow back onto? I would say that, like we said earlier in this discussion, I think the blowback came mostly from members who had signed the letter in June and were caught totally off guard, blindsided that it was released in October. I think they were the ones who really push back so hard that the whole effort fell apart. I think the blowback will be on Jayapal. I think that her credibility is damaged, but also on the Quincy Institute itself, who played a role in the drafting this letter and also its release. Their reputation is going to be damaged by this whole incident, and their credibility in Washington, which is what they're trying to influence. So what do we lose when Quincy are damaged, when Jayapal is damaged, and the voice that they bring to the table? I can look to another initiative that many restrainers were involved in from earlier this year that I think was a pretty valuable contribution in the discussion. And that was the letter that circulated saying that the United States should not consider or even talk about a no-fly zone for Ukraine, trying to shut down the discussion about a no-fly zone.
Adam Kinzinger's idiotic idea.
This wasn't really intended as much towards the administration. It was kind of backing them up because the people in the U.S. government understood a no-fly zone couldn't happen. But it was aimed at shaping the media narrative. There was a lot of discussion in the media about a no-fly zone by people who did not understand what it actually meant. And so many in the restrainer camp got this initiative together, wrote this letter saying, you need to understand what a no-fly zone is. This is what a no-fly zone is. It means that you're in a hot war. It means that you're shooting down Russian aircraft. And that would put us in a war with Russia. You need to understand that. Let's stop talking about this. It's a terrible idea. And after that letter circulated, I think it had real impact because I stopped hearing people talking about no-fly zones after that. It was necessary. It was relevant. It was very well written. The whole initiative was a big success and made a positive impact. So yeah, things like this can go missing when voices in that camp aren't being listened to, right? And also, we talked with Mark Hansen about the need for something like a cigar for Ukraine. I imagine that many people in the restrainer camp would be advocating for something like that. That's something that you and I see value in, that we'd like to see. If there's going to be advocacy for something like that coming out of their camp, that's also valuable. So yeah, there's valuable stuff to bring to the table, and it's a shame if we're going to lose that. Now, the third thing is, what is the collapse of this effort going to have on actual policy? If I'm looking at sources of the grander scheme, larger picture, flagging support for Ukraine, because that's what many people were worried about with this letter. I don't think it's going to come from stuff like this. I look at this letter, like I said, it's rather anodyne, rather fluffy, rather vague. I don't look at stuff like this and say, this is where we're going to see the seeds of our fatigue with supporting Ukraine. This is more what I think we need to consider. This winter, fuel costs in Europe are going to increase. Russia have a role in this, and the Russian situation has a big role in this, because in December, these fuel embargoes are about to become active. The European countries are going to they're going to put in place the actual bans of these Russian energy exports. And this could cause fuel prices to go really high in Europe. And this could impact the US and the global energy market as well. So when citizens in these countries are seeing their fuel prices go way up, are they going to say, we're sick of this, let's let Russia take this territory, let's stop being so aggressive at limiting their exports and arming the Ukrainians? We're fed up with it. Our costs are going through the roof. We've got new leadership in key countries. We have new leadership in the UK, right? Rishi Sunak, a guy who's more economically focused. His foreign policy vision is a little bit of black box right now. Maybe that's probably an exaggeration, but we don't have as good an idea about how he's going to approach this stuff. In Italy, we have new leadership. Meloni and her coalition include people like Berlusconi and Salvini and their parties, the Liga and the Forza Italia, who are pro-Russia, right? In Sweden, we have new leadership. They're a country that are trying to join NATO and had been taking a tough line on the Russia issue. They've got new leadership, right? So some of these key countries, new leadership, fuel costs going up, how are they going to respond? That's, I think, what we need to look at if we're concerned about flagging support for Ukraine, a reluctance to continue arming Ukraine and containing Russia economically. That's what I'm thinking about. I'm not thinking about stuff like this letter.
That's very helpful. I think that at the end of the day, and I really have to underline this, I disagree with the central aim of the letter because of the context that it was released in. But I genuinely have disagreements with progressives a lot of the time. and our system works easiest when, dissension is shut up and really mitigated. But at the end of the day, I truly believe in our system. And I believe that when it comes to times of peace and war, specifically war, we need more debate. We need more voices. So I truly hope that this letter and the blowback, because John, the blowback was near universal and very swift, that it doesn't damage the credibility of these folks and these institutions to the point where they can't have a differing set of opinions, because that would be ultimately a bad thing overall. But I think that this is probably a good place to end.